Influencers are so good at knowing how they look good that the images they pick are normally going to be great anyway. It's always a struggle to like try and get outside your box, because I feel with Instagram especially, people kind of just want to see the same thing again and again. If you spread yourself too wide, like nothing feels like consistent and you just feel like a little bit messy.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to another episode of the KDigitals podcast, where we dive into artists, their origin, the style, and the process. Joining me today is Mr. Steve Reed. How are you doing today, Steve?
I'm really good, thank you for having me. Excited to talk photography. It feels like I get the opportunity to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you got great photos. I came across your profile a few months ago. There's a model influencer in there, I think, Annetta Berry. And I
Okay,
saw
sure.
some stuff you did, and I was like, oh, I'm going to follow this photographer. He got some good stuff.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I like to shoot like influencers a lot of the time because it feels like they rarely shoot with a lot of photographers. So I feel like you can get some like unique pictures and that sort of helps you stand out like on their feed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, agreed. I definitely want to ask you more about that, because that's something I always cared about. There's a model bucket and then there's influencer bucket, and the more I'm learning is they're not the same.
Yeah.
They're two different personalities.
Yeah, yeah, that's I think a really good insight. And I think there is like a lot of attempts to cross over from both sides. And I think it's very interesting when you start working with sort of influencers and models and sort of their perspectives on the industry and like influencing versus modeling.
Mm-hmm. Uh, Before we dive into that, and I'll give context why, is when I kick off every podcast, I always like to kind of have the guests define themselves. And it feels like it's pretty obvious you're a photographer, but is that how you see yourself? Do you do more than just photography? Do you see yourself more as an artist? How do you see yourself?
Yeah, like I have heard sort of my kind of style being referenced as like pop photography, which I
Oh,
really like as a description. I think Jared Coca like called himself that, or maybe it was somebody else. But because there's always this tension between like fashion and commercial, and like I don't feel like I fit into either one that firmly. Like
mhm.
fashion people think I'm too commercial, and commercial people think I'm too fashion. So I kind of like that like kind of middle ground of sort of being sort of a pop photographer and sort of embracing that kind of like just like good pictures ultimately to me,
Mhm.
but sort of a focus on like candid kind of feel and like just casual and like just fun and like bright and poppy, which is what I try and go for.
Yeah. So that's a perfect transition back into the influencer conversation, because influencers are, would that be more commercial kind of work, like the work they do, and so you're kind of just falling into that, or
Yeah, like I think influencing is really interesting how it sort of developed over like the last couple of years to being, I think, the primary economy in generating images, especially sort of still images, because that kind of marketing has really taken over. And I think I offer something different than influencers typically like post, but it feels like close enough to like what they want that they're still like happy to work with me, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah.
Because I think that's like always a challenge to work with somebody that is in charge of like curating their feed, especially sort of if they have like, you know, millions of followers. They have a very sort of specific idea of what their pictures look like. And I
Mhm.
think it's a challenge and like very rewarding when you can like work with somebody and like get an image you took on like their feed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think for me the biggest accomplishment is always if they change their Instagram profile photo to my photo, then I know I did a good job.
Yeah. My favorite game is always when you have like the Instagram stories on the top of Instagram and you have like the little circles. If you get like three in a row that like you've taken a profile picture off, like that's like a win for
Oh,
me.
yeah. Yeah, it's like a little bingo. Um, well, so a lot of times, like photographers I know, they're really big into being in control. Like they want their photos, they want
Yeah.
their look. And I know working influencers on my end, they can be more controlling too because they have their own brand. So how does that work
Yeah.
for you in that kind of facet?
So I think that's always like an interesting change, because before it used to always be like the photographer's way was the higher way, and like here are the images that you've edited, and like the model can't say anything about it. Maybe she'll
Mhm.
post one, but like ultimately like you had that creative voice. And for me, I always kind of like struggled a little bit, because when I'm shooting somebody, I'm like essentially collaborating with them, and I kind of see them as like a creative partner. And I think that mentality translates well to working with an influencer, because like I'm bringing them along through like the selects process. I'll send them contact sheets and like be really sort of receptive of things they want like edited and things like that. So like they're like included in the process, so like there's no surprises. Like I'm not suddenly like dropping a picture that they hate on my Instagram that they're gonna like
Mhm.
hide on their profile. Sort of,
Mm.
I always think it's like important, like I'll always like send like, oh, this is what I want to post, is that okay with you? And they'll like say yes, or like, oh, could you like sort of change this maybe?
Mhm.
And to me, like I think that's key, especially with working with influencers, is to let them have like an element of control. And like it's hard because sometimes you'll fall in love with like a picture that they like don't necessarily want, so you have
Yeah.
to like be willing to kill your babies. But ultimately like these influencers are so good at knowing how they look good, that like the images they pick
Mm.
are normally going to be great anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because like I said, I have friends who'll be like, "You don't get to see the previews, you'll get what you get." I'm like, "But what if they want
Yeah,
that?" But there are times where like same thing, I'll be with the model or influencer to go through the selects, and they'll
yeah,
go by a really good photo. I'm like, why not that one? And like, why like this one more? And like, oh, okay, I never saw it from that perspective. I guess that's okay.
yeah. It's always tough, because I think everybody's like looking at something with different eyes. And especially like I think being in this industry like as a woman and being like on camera, like it's so
Mm.
difficult because your body is essentially becoming a commodity. And I think that really is intense, to like look at pictures of yourself, and like that's your business, and like you're making these like decisions like, oh, like is this post gonna like get me the right like sponsor deal from whatever company and things like that. So I always try and be like really empathetic with sort of what they're looking for in images. Does
Mhm.
that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's cool that you do, like you said, like you really collaborate as a creative partner, right? You
Yeah.
understand.
Well, I think there's a lot of like photographers that have like a very oppositional view with like models. It's very like us versus them. And
Mm.
I remember spending a lot of time in like Facebook photography groups where like it's always like you'll see those like, oh, can you believe this like person like messaged me to collab? Like, oh, I can't believe it. I'm like too like big to collab with her. And they always make me laugh, because I get like, 10 of those messages a day, but I'm always just like, oh, like actually here's my rate, or like I'll ignore it if it's like just time wasty. But
Mhm.
like there seems to be like such a, I think, mentality with some photographers that are like, oh, they're the enemy, like the only like good people in this industry are like other photographers, and they all sit in their like Facebook groups and like complain.
Yeah. Yeah. When I started to kind of take photography more seriously to professional, it was that's funny you say it's very oppositional, right? Because it would be photographers, not it's blanketing, right? But like
Yeah,
photographers don't pay for models, but models don't pay for photographers. And it's just like, well, then who pays who? How do we make money if no one wants to pay each other? So
yeah, I mean, like I'm lucky enough that like most of my work is like paid testing and things like that now.
yeah.
And like I'll sort of really, figure out with, collaborative shoots and things like that, like who works best for my portfolio. And like, I'll work with like somebody like Anata, who like people like follow her and they're like, oh, he's like shot with Anata, like he must be like worth shooting
Mm.
with and things like that. So that's kind of how
Yeah.
I view some collaborations. But also like
Yeah.
Anata's a great model, and like it's fun taking pictures of her.
Yeah. And I think that's the cool part is just like there really is just a vibe with like models versus influencers, and the influencers just have cool content, right? There's just
Yeah, and I'll like turn up to a shoot with like, wild like designer items and things like that. Like Aneta like styled that whole shoot herself. And like I think some of it was like SponCon, and then like some of it was just like, oh, she really likes like Balenciaga and like has a lot of Balenciaga.
Mm-hmm. So you're obviously big now, working with these type of people and brands and all that. How did you get started though with photography?
So I started way back on Flickr. So it was like very much like a hobby back then. I
Mm-hmm.
moved to London to pursue a master's degree in something completely unrelated and joined sort of the photography club just as a way to like meet people. And I was taking pictures of like ducks and like trains and things like that, like just terrible
Okay.
black and white stuff. And then on Twitter, this was almost like pre-Instagram. It sounds like very old, but it was like maybe 10 years ago.
Okay.
And so I was following this photographer, Rosie Hardy, who was like very like did a lot of these like photoshops where it's like she made like giant like coffee cups, like very like Flickr, like if that makes sense, like that like era was a lot of like self-portraiture and like it was very like a lot of Photoshop weirdness. And then she needed an assistant and like I like responded and like sent over my
Oh.
CV and I sort of started assisting her, like doing a lot of like emails for her. And she did like a Maroon 5 cover randomly, like, and I sort of helped facilitate that. And then through her, I started assisting a fashion photographer, Lara Jade.
Oh, really? Like,
Yeah,
okay.
which is interesting. So I assisted Laura for a few years and like I got a lot of experience there, like being on sort of her sets and helping her out. And like through her, I started getting paid assisting work as she was getting paid fashion work. And that sort of really like gave me a lot of confidence to stay in the industry. And
Mhm.
then I started assisting another photographer, Jay Mawson, who did a lot of like magazines here. And like every now and then I'll still assist him because he'll like have like a job. He's based in Manchester and I'm in London.
Mhm.
So sometimes he'll have like a job in London. It's like, hey, like it's like, you know, this rate, can you do it? And if I'm free, I'll do it. And just being on sort of those like sets with sort of higher profile clients like really gave me a good sense of the industry and sort of like what it looks like and how to like operate within it.
Mhm.
And then
What
sorry.
no, sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
And then like over that course, I started like interacting more with like models on set and sort of got a lot more confident in like shooting models myself and contacting agencies. And I sort of had that in like, oh, like I worked with blah, blah, blah on like this job with Lara J. Like, are you open to like test and stuff like that? And then agencies were very receptive of that as like an icebreaker versus me just like randomly being like, oh, I want to take some pictures of models.
Mhm.
So I think that was like really important in like establishing my, I think, reputation.
Yeah. What what were you, if it's okay to ask, what were you going for your master's for?
Intelligence and international security.
That's totally different than influencers and Balenciaga.
Yeah, yeah, it's a different lifetime ago, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And now 10 years later, here you are. Right. That's cool.
yeah.
So with your style, I guess that's something I always want to dive into is um what are you shooting with? Like is it, it looks like you're shooting film, but is it film or are you just putting a Photoshop filter
No,
on it?
no, I'm just adding grain.
You are. Okay, I figured.
Yeah, it's I like have a lot of respect for photographers that still shoot on film. It's just
Hmm.
so expensive and cumbersome, I find. And
Yeah.
if you're just posting it on Instagram anyway, and everybody's just looking on their phone, you can get so close with grain simulation.
Hmm.
So it's
Yeah.
just like a 5D Mark IV.
So I've been telling people for a while, like right now I shoot Nikon and I want to transition to either the Mark III or the Mark IV.
Yeah,
So is there a part of you that feels you like that camera a lot and you haven't gone mirrorless?
it's I mean it's a big topic now, like mirrorless, because they're not making a Mark V. So like my next camera is gonna have to be like a mirrorless maybe.
Hmm.
But I'm still really happy with the Mark IV. For me, it's just like muscle control and like it feels good in my hands. I know what all the buttons do. And I've been basically using that setup from the Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV. So for me, it's just kind of like that legacy in a sense, and like mirrorless just scares me because you have to learn a whole new range of like controls, and like, well, I
Yeah.
have to get new lenses, and it's just
Yeah.
like it's just a lot. And the thing is, like, it's working fine for me right now. Like, I've got my like setup with Capture One, and I don't update anything on my iMac, so everything works perfectly. And then sort of the second you get a new camera, then it's like, oh, I need to upgrade like Photoshop or Capture, or oh, I
Mhm.
now need to buy a new computer because my like 2012 like iMac doesn't want to run files anymore.
Oh yeah, that's yeah.
So it's just, for me, it's like I want to push that decision as far down the road as I can.
Yeah. So
But
if your Mark IV broke, knock on wood, right? Would you just buy another Mark IV, or would you say, okay, now's the time?
man, I mean, I have like my Mark III still as like a backup, so I might dip back down, but I'm kind of holding out for like the next generation of mirrorlesses, like the R6 Mark II or whatever they're gonna do. So I
Mhm.
think Canon is still like on their first like generation. But I have a wedding photographer friend, and she shoots on the mirrorless ones now, the Canon ones, and she loves them. So like maybe I'll just like make that jump if I have to, but just
Not yet.
as long as I can, I'm happy with my setup.
Mhm. Uh, so the Canon, especially the Marks, are good for video too. Do you ever do video work, or do you just focus photos?
No, I kind of made that decision. I just didn't want to chase down video. It felt like I was spreading myself too thin, and maybe that decision is gonna like bite me in the ass in the future. But I mean, I've like dabbled with it here and there, but it's just never been something I've like had the space to shoot, if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah, I get that.
it just feels, again, like now you're like getting into continuous lights and things like that, and like then you have to care about sound, and then it's like a computer workflow, like then you have to learn Premiere or whatever.
Mhm.
So I'm quite happy doing the stills, although it does feel like video feels inevitable, especially with sort of the upcoming like Instagram changes that they're like experimenting with, and sort
Yeah.
of the pressure to make TikToks and things like that. But then so
Mhm.
much of that video content is like shot on phones and things like that anyway. So again, I guess like I'm just happy doing what I'm doing as long as I can.
Yeah, no, I get that. I feel like that's becoming a recurring theme too with some photographers, where they feel like they got really good at photos and that's what they do, but the pull of
Yeah.
social media is pulling, right?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, video is tough as well, because it's like I think we've all seen like photographers that do those kind of like, like those sexy 2-3 minute videos. Like I feel like I've seen so many like from like LA and things like that. And I know a guy in London who like does great video. He still does mostly stills, but it just feels like, what is the audience for that content, where it feels like the video content that does well is that kind of like influencer style video things, and like it feels like hard to replicate that as a photographer, because you're not like following someone to like their like get ready with me daily routine.
Hmm.
So,
So how is your photography different then? 'Cause if you go to your photography, it's all like a lot of like lingerie, hard flash kind of stuff. So do you consider that kind of that same like Instagram sexy crowd, or do you feel like it's a different vibe?
I mean, people say it's different, but like I'm not necessarily sure how, but I guess that like style does have like a negative reputation from some of the people who pioneered it, like Terry Richardson and things like that. And I feel like every like week I see some meme about like how on camera flash is like low effort, but for me it just fits with my style. Like I really like that it's low effort, and you can focus a lot more on like interacting with models, and like just sort of reducing the complexity of a shoot.
Hmm. Do you ever, obviously that's what you post on Instagram, but do you ever like shoot things outside of that type of look? Or is it like you just focus purely on
Yeah, like I'm always happy to try things out. Like I do like beauty tests and things like that, and then I shoot outside, but like it sort of doesn't get the traction that like the white wall stuff does.
Hmm.
Like unfortunately, like I think we're creatures of like feedback, and sort of if something is doing
Mm,
numbers, you want to do more of that. And I think it's always a struggle to like try and get outside your box, because I feel with Instagram especially, people kind of just want to see the same thing again and again. Like I'm really like proud of some of the like outside shoots I've done. Like I've done some really cool like beach shoots, and like I've done like more editorial things, but
mhm.
at the end of the day, like people come to me for like the underwear stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like I said, I think because you have that consistency too, right? It helps kind of build that brand.
Yeah, I think like establishing like niches and specialties is really important in this industry, because I think if you spread yourself too wide, like nothing feels like consistent, and you just feel like a little bit messy as a creative or content creator or whatever we're called now.
Hmm. Yeah. Content creator should become like the new word, huh? Like you're no longer just a photographer, you're a content creator.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Like I'm just like happy sort of staying in my lane a little bit. As long as sort of people come to me for that kind of thing, I'll keep shooting it.
Yeah. Well, so I guess on that note of consistency, knowing what you like, know what you're good at, what are your, I guess, like goals over the next like 5 years? Like, do you plan on just staying where you are?
I mean, that's a very like intense question, like the 5 year plan and things like that.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I feel like there is like a time limit on like how long I'm like shooting for, because I definitely don't want to like be like an old man like taking pictures of like 20-year-old girls in their underwear.
Hmm.
So like I do kind of start thinking about like, you know, leaving the not leaving the industry, but maybe like moving to like representation and things like that, like because I'm working with influencers so much, like, and every now and then I'll like help them with like sponsorship deals or like reading contracts. Like I could see myself getting
Oh,
like like representing people, or like functioning as a manager maybe, or like just more like production based things.
yeah. Like kind of thinking behind the camera, like really just put the camera away.
Yeah, and like just doing emails, I guess, and sort of negotiating rates and things like that, which is always a lot easier to do for other people than yourself.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I feel it. Um, well, so Steve, I am running your time, so I wanted to ask one last question. Um,
Okay.
being someone that's done this for as long as you have and worked with a lot of great people, what's some advice you could give to a budding photographer that's trying to figure out how to grow?
I feel like ultimately just being empathetic with the people you're working with. Like I mentioned the Facebook groups earlier, and I think it is like important to like have a network of peers, but I feel like again, like that put me in like I think a negative mindset for a while with working with like models and makeup artists and other creatives. I think really like your focus should be on establishing relationships with sort of the people you interact with, because you're not really doing a lot with other photographers outside of assisting them maybe, but like you're doing a lot with like models and makeup artists. And if you build those relationships, those are going to be much more powerful than like, you know, doing posts in a Facebook group about photography. I'm just like
Mhm.
really anti photography Facebook groups now.
Yeah, man, I get it. Yeah, photographers, yeah, that's a whole nother, that's a podcast on its own. Talk about personalities, right?
But assisting is like definitely important if you can get into it. Like I think without assisting, I wouldn't be in this industry right now. Like it was a way to like make money, like good money to start out with, and it's a good way to learn the ropes and like build connections and things like that. So I'd definitely recommend trying to like assist local photographers.
Hmm. Hmm. For sure. Well, hey, Steve, I appreciate you giving me your time today.
No worries. I
Working.
hope that was all right.
Yeah, that was good. I think I told you like maybe 20, 30 minutes. And I definitely went over. So I appreciate it again, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
feel like we talked way too much about like the Mark IV or whatever.
it's funny because I feel like those conversations are always very the same conversation, but they're always interesting, right?
Yeah, like to me, like gear, I try not to think about that at all. Like I just have like my setup, and to me, it's just muscle memory. And for me, a shoot is just about the images. And I know that sounds like very pretentious, but I feel like it's so easy to get into like, oh, dynamic range and sharpness and like,
Yeah, but it also feels like to me it's fun to learn.
yeah,
But so it's like the I feel like the people that are very like very 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 gear obsessed are the Facebook group photographers,
oh yeah, like
right?
taking
Like
the pictures of the birds and things like that. And like, oh, check out the sharpness and depth of
yeah,
field. Like, I mean, it is like a tool, and like you should learn like how to use your tools. Like
yeah,
I have a friend, and she's a photographer, and she's always like, oh, I don't need to learn that, I'm like a girl. And I'm like, no, like it doesn't matter what your gender is, like learn how to use your camera, like get off
yeah,
like auto.
yeah, yeah. It's there's always that like constant reel that comes up of you're not a real photographer until you learn manual. Like, oh, I thought everyone knew manual. I thought that's how you're supposed to do it. But
Yeah, and I think like, I mean, ultimately the picture is what matters, and like people are taking great pictures in like ways that would seem like insane as like sort of professional photographers, like, but at the end of the day, like the picture is what is the thing.
matters. Yeah, for sure. Well, hey Steve, thanks again for your time today. Where
No
can
worries.
people follow you and learn more about your content or see more of your content?
I just Steve takes pictures, which is I'm really happy I have that Instagram username. I feel like it's like a big part of my like identity as a photographer.
Mhm. For sure. Well, I'll go ahead and stop the recording and we'll end it
All
here.
right.
Thank you for everyone that's joined us today. Go ahead and follow Steve on Instagram and everywhere else he's on. And we'll see y'all later. Thanks, everyone.